Welcome to the Leadership Reality Series, where we explore what really gets in the way of transformation, execution, and meaningful organizational change in an age shaped by disruption, AI, and constant pressure to deliver. I'm Liesel van Rooyen, and in every episode, I'm joined by Alexa Terblanche, transformation leader, strategic facilitator, and organizational change practitioner who brings deep experience in helping leaders, teams, and business navigate complexity, align around purpose, and turn meaningful change into practical action. Alexa will lead each conversation with Giles Lindsay, asking the questions that help uncover the real leadership challenges behind transformation, agility, execution, and organizational change. Giles is a globally recognized CIO, CTO, board advisor, keynote speaker, CEO of Agile Delta Consulting, creator of the Clear Model, and author of the Amazon best-selling books, Clearly Agile and The Adaptive Leader. With nearly 3 decades of experience from software engineering in the late 1990s through to executive leadership across global organizations, Giles has helped boards, leadership teams, and organizations close the gap between strategy, execution, and measurable business outcomes. In today's first episode, Alexa and Giles tackle a bold statement that challenges how many organizations still approach transformation, agility, and leadership. Leadership, not frameworks, is the real problem.
Giles, you've made that statement in your book, in your keynote talks, and in your work with leadership teams around the world. And honestly, it's a provocative one. So let's start there. What do you really mean by leadership, not frameworks, is the real problem?
Hi, both. Thank you very much for having me here. And I love it. That statement usually gets gets a reaction and quite a strong one at times. And honestly, it really should as well. Because for years, from my perspective, organizations have invested millions in frameworks, coaches, tools, certifications, transformation programs, operating model redesigns. How many more can I add? And now today, even AI initiatives. And yet, from my perspective, many are still dealing with exactly the same frustrations. Today decisions are slow, priorities are constantly shifting, teams are waiting for approvals. Leaders talk about empowerment, but still pull decision-making kind of back to the center of leadership when that pressure rises. And I've been in that space for nearly 30 years, as Liesel mentioned, starting as that software engineer when I first came across frameworks like extreme programming and Scrum, long before Agile even became that industry buzzword as it is today. And I would say probably across every role since, from those engineering days through to my CIO and CTO roles, I've seen that same pattern repeat itself over and over and over. Frameworks rarely fail first, right? For me, leadership systems do. And the way priorities are set, the speed of decision-making, the way funding works, the level of trust leaders genuinely place in their teams, those are usually the things that start slowing transformation down long before any framework gets blamed.
When leaders hear you say frameworks are not the problem, what do they usually get wrong?
What many leaders get wrong is assuming that a framework is that solution in its own right, that silver bullet, that cookie cutter that's just absolutely going to solve everything for the organization's sake. And they often believe that if they bring in something like Scrum, SAFe, a new operating model, or even some sort of new AI tooling and the framework that comes with it, the organization will somehow become more adaptive, more collaborative, more innovative. Actually, the reality is that frameworks are just simply tools. They don't fix leadership behaviors in any way, shape, or form. What they do is actually amplify whatever already exists. And for me, if leadership is unclear, inconsistent, or overly controlling, those same behaviors show up inside that framework as well. And I often say that command and control wrapped in an agile language is still command and control. You can't get away from that. You cannot delegate agility to teams while leadership continues operating exactly the same way as it always has. And so if leadership does not change, the framework becomes another process layered on top of the existing old behaviors.
Yeah, there's no flow through from above, and it's just dictating another framework. So how can leadership team tell if they have a framework problem or a leadership problem?
I think there are usually very obvious signals once you begin to know what you're looking for. Teams may appear busy, ceremonies inside the organization might be happening, dashboards may even look healthy, but actually underneath that, people are waiting for decisions. As we all know, priorities change every week. And sometimes leaders end up bypassing agreed ways of working when something feels urgent. Delivery teams are then started to be blamed for delays, even when the real issue sits elsewhere. One of the clearest signs for me is when teams are capable of moving faster than the organization actually allows them to. They're ready to deliver. They're ready to experiment. They're ready to learn. But leadership systems, approvals, governance, conflicting priorities, these are all the things that keep slowing everything down inside the organization. And when I see that pattern, it's almost never a framework problem. It's usually a true leadership bottleneck.
Yeah, we see that a lot in the South African organizations where one department is actually performing and delivering, and then it may be business that's slowing them down because they actually don't know what their functioning need. They don't know what their customers need. Now, Tommy, so you've worked from being a software engineer right through to board level. When did this start becoming obvious to you?
There was one experience that really brought this home for me many years ago. I was working with a large global organization that actually invested heavily in a digital/agile transformation for the business. Now, the organization we had coaches, the organization ended up having training. We had the ceremonies, we had the dashboards full of the metrics that, every stakeholder wanted to see. And as such, on screen, on paper, whatever it was, everything looked healthy. But when you spent time with the teams, and in my senior leadership role, I had to do that, the reality felt really different, right? People were frustrated, and I was flabbergasted by this. Decisions still took too long. Priorities, therefore, were constantly changing for the people and the teams. Teams were being able then to ask to move faster, while leadership behaviors remained exactly the same. And that was a moment it really clicked for me. That agility in the organization was not failing. The teams were not failing. Leadership alignment was the thing that was missing. And therefore, executive behaviors had not evolved inside the organization to match the change they were asking everyone else to make inside the business. And that lesson has stayed with me ever since. It stayed with me throughout every leadership role I've ever done.
And it seems like something that is actually so obvious. But I mean, it's fundamental to how organizations run. Why do leadership teams struggle to change, in your opinion?
Great question. Let me think. I mean, if I actually look at the sort of the hub of the issue, I think leadership change is deeply personal. I would actually even say at times it's often uncomfortable. It's much easier to buy a framework, hire some consultants to come in, launch a new program of change, introduce a new tool for the organization, than it is to look honestly at your own leadership behaviors. Now, for me, real leadership change often means giving up control. And here's the key word that we've used many times in our discussions. It means trusting teams to make decisions. It means changing those decision rights, becoming more transparent, becoming more comfortable with experimentation, and accepting ultimately that the old ways that made you successful are no longer enough to go forward. And for me, and I've seen it many times, that's really hard for many leaders, especially those who've built really successful careers in more traditional, old school organizational structures. And so therefore, frameworks are relatively easy to buy. But leadership change is much harder because leaders themselves have to do the evolving.
So practically, what actually happens when organizations keep focusing on these frameworks instead of the leadership?
Great question, Alexa. I think what usually happens is what I call transformation theater, right? I think we can all get that image in our heads right now of what that ultimately looked like. You know, the language changes, the ceremonies appear, the new tools are introduced, the dashboards look absolutely impressive with all the colors. People start using the right terminology, you know, and it looks like progress from the outside looking in. But actually, what's happening is underneath, very little ever really changes. Teams, I've seen it many times, teams become frustrated. Cynicism as well starts to grow inside the organization. Delivery costs start rising, you know, people become exhausted by that constant change, those change initiatives that never quite deliver the outcomes that were promised at the start. And what I've seen time and time again is that the leadership team and the organization starts blaming, agile, agility, AI, transformation, or even the teams themselves, when in reality, the frameworks actually survived, but the transformation quietly died because the leadership never changed.
Yeah, that's so true. And where should leaders actually start?
Another great question. Well, I can tell you where they should not start. Leaders should not start with frameworks, right? Let me look at it that way.
Reiterate that point strongly.
Yeah, leaders should not start with frameworks. Let's put it up there in big letters and, big lights as well. I said it earlier, but they need to start with themselves and with the system that they've actually created around their people and teams. They should start by asking really honest questions, like, how are decisions really made here in our business? How quickly can priorities actually be changed? Where does accountability genuinely sit inside the business as well? Again, we're back to the T word again. How much trust exists between leadership and that delivery capability? Next are teams truly empowered to do things the best way possible to delight the customer? Or actually, are they still waiting for approval from leadership at every step of the delivery journey? And ultimately, this is why I created my CLEAR model as a diagnostics capability. And CLEAR stands for culture, leadership, execution, adaptability, and responsiveness. And culture for me is absolutely key about how decisions actually get made when that pressure really starts to rise. You know, leadership is about direction. It's about trust. It's about one of my favorite words, clarity. Execution is about turning intent into actual outcomes to delight those customers and stakeholders. And adaptability is about learning and adjusting as conditions change. And lastly, responsiveness is about acting quickly on new insights you have before competitors have that information. And for me, that is where the real transformation and change begins inside the organization.
That's very powerful. My last question before we wrap up was going to be about, what is one truth that you want leaders listening to today to remember and really take away? And I think you've already highlighted that is that you don't start with a framework.
Yeah, let's get that back out there again in big flashing lights on the screen. Leaders don't start with the frameworks, right? Perhaps we can superimpose that over this. Yeah, it's a great question. And that one truth, I think the biggest truth I would leave leaders with is this. Agility was never meant to be a team sport, just at the team level, at that delivery level inside an organization. It was always meant to be a leadership responsibility. Teams cannot out-adapt leadership inside the business, right? They can't out-decide leadership. Teams can't out-execute the system that leadership has created around them. And therefore, right, if ultimately leadership stays the same, right, frameworks eventually become that theater that I was talking about. And they may look impressive for a while, but I can tell you, the outcomes rarely change in a meaningful way. And so therefore, when leadership evolves, everything changes, right? Decision-making improves, trust increases, teams move faster, execution, fingers crossed, becomes clearer. Organizations become genuinely adaptive. That, for me, is the real difference. And that, for me, is where lasting transformation actually begins.
Wow. I'm truly inspired. Alexa and Giles, what an amazing conversation you just had. And that feels like the perfect place for us to leave episode 1. So thank you, Alexa, for leading such a thoughtful and important conversation. And thank you, Giles, for sharing your insight, your experience, and your honesty on what really gets in the way of transformation. In our next episode, we explore another hard truth. Why strategy often looks brilliant in the boardroom, yet quietly dies in execution. Join us for episode 2, The Execution Gap.